we oftentimes in law enforcement, you have to convince somebody that what may ultimately result in a loss of their freedom is ultimately the best decision. When you're in charge, be in charge. But when you're not in charge, be a really, really good teammate.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our podcast, Inside National Security by the National Security Academy. Today, I have a very special guest, Stephanie Yanta. It's great to sit down with you, and good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So, I know that you have a long experience both in critical infrastructure. You worked for the FBI. You worked on various different things. I also know that you collaborated with the National Guard, if I'm not mistaken, etc. Right?
Sure.
So you're very involved when it comes to national security. So I'd like to hear from you. Could you tell the audience a bit more about your background and what made you get into the field of national security?
Great. It's really my pleasure to be here and thank you for having me. I think my journey really started, as a kid. I grew up in a very small town in Northwest Indiana outside of Chicago. My high school graduating class was 38 kids.
Mhm.
So while it was a public school, it was very much a family. And you think, well, gee, what are you going to do? You're from this small town. How can you really make an impact? And really, I think it has to do with really taking initiative and following your dream. And I'll tell you, out of high school, I thought one of two things. I was either going to be a doctor or I wanted to be in the CIA. Now,
Okay.
those two things are really not congruent at all, are they? It's when I got into college and really joined the ROTC program where I was an officer, in training in the Army, that I really started to hone in, on my love of the mission, that giving back and that service. So that was really my initial foray into national security. Was my endeavors with the Reserve Officer Training Corps at Indiana University. And I think my background as well. My family comes from a long line of service, um, military, police officers, teachers, folks who really give back to the community. So I think that was sort of in my upbringing and always in the back of my mind. So that's really how I got into, the FBI. I was a military intelligence officer in the Army, and at the time we were drawing down our active duty force. So it was just very fortuitous that I was able to um, really get a full-time active duty position with the state of Indiana, working countering drug missions. So I was supporting federal, state, and local law enforcement as a military intelligence analyst, so providing analytic support along with a team that I ran in countering drugs. And I just really loved that. I loved the fact that we were making a difference, that I wasn't necessarily boots on the street, but really leveraging all I had learned from my military intelligence training to help with the mission set. And that was really my foray into the FBI. I had the very distinct pleasure of working all sorts of violations within the FBI's purview. So worked, violent crime for about 10 years. Had a very large drug case that still is. Kudos to my team, which was a bunch of ladies. We have the biggest drug seizure in the DMV. We call it here the District, Maryland, and Virginia, where we actually worked a drug case all the way back to the cartel. And if you think about it, that's sort of old hat today, right? I wish we had the tools that are in place now, back then. But just a really great case, and that was sort of my catapult into more of the traditional national security side of the house. So counterterrorism, a bit of countering intelligence. I had the privilege of working at our headquarters where we really were in the thick of things post 9/11, with multiple attacks on the homeland. to include, for example, the Times Square attempted bombing in New York City. I had the privilege of running the team from headquarters that really oversaw programmatically that entire investigation, which, as you know, spanned not only here in the continental U.S. but OCONUS as well. So very extensive and complex investigation, and just really an interesting time, I think, for the FBI. Right, we had changed post 9/11, from a traditional or more traditional law enforcement organization, and really took a leading role in the intelligence community, from the sense of protecting the homeland. So just really interesting to see that sea change, within the FBI, and how we really tried to, break down barriers between the FBI and other members of the intelligence community, always keeping in mind, right, our mission is to disrupt, right, and sometimes, you want to put handcuffs on someone, and that's a good thing.
Mhm.
So really an interesting, career. And, I think ending my career at our behavioral analysis unit, within the FBI. So I was a certified profiler, so think of Silence of the Lambs. Um, had the privilege of working a number of cases, and that work is really hard, because it's more on the prevention side of things. You're trying to dissuade someone from going down that pathway, to engage in an act of targeted violence. And it's hard to quantify the success, but I have no doubt, our team did amazing, amazing work in preventing, multiple, violent acts from taking place. So just really a great way to end my career, leveraging, all of those skills that I had learned and really become quite good at, throughout my tenure at the Bureau, in a way that was a little uh, less traditional.
Well, very interesting, very interesting. I mean, there's many things I want to comment on. First off, I like the journey and how you mentioned that the FBI changed because it still has kind of that, from what I've been told, the corporate culture, which is more focused on the law enforcement side, right, to this day. And then how later it changed with 9/11, especially, and so forth. Very interesting. And I do know that you wrote a white paper, you co-authored a white paper for the Department of Homeland Security, where you spoke about AI and also these illicit crimes, right? Such as
Hmm.
drug trafficking and so forth.
Hmm.
Could you tell the audience a bit more about that and what you investigated there?
Yeah, it was a really amazing opportunity. I was part of a program sponsored by the Department of Homeland Security, wherein, private sector professionals came together in a multitude of cohorts. As you mentioned, we were specifically focused on, how AI is being used, to really advance, illicit crimes. And it was really an amazing journey because, the ubiquity of computers, is so commonplace today. Whereas, for example, when I started my law enforcement journey, I mean, geez, we had one computer in the squad area, and probably one person knew how to use it. Things were still done on a typewriter. So, the fact that we now have to think about, as law enforcement and national security professionals, use of AI by the bad guys, is really a paradigm shift, I think, for many, especially folks who didn't necessarily grow up with computers and the internet. It's something that we've learned. So, our cohort really dove into, not only the AI tools that are out there, but how they're being leveraged by the bad guys. Importantly, how we as national security professionals can thwart, mitigate, disrupt, get in front of the use of those tools. And then I think extremely important is the fact that the policy hasn't really caught up yet, right? The nature of technology is so advanced and so quickly moving that it's very difficult to, get policy through, the very arduous machine that is, policy makers and acceptance of those policies. So we really looked at ways of how can we today, as a national security team, right? And that doesn't mean just US, but our partners as well, right? How can we together look at what is out there and then collaboratively, devise a plan to get in front of these nefarious actors? And I'll tell you, it's not easy.
So what then led you after this long time of public service to go your own way with your own company that you started and so forth, and then you being more engaged, potentially speaking and so forth? How did that come to be?
I think all good things must come to an end.
Yes.
And I felt like my time at the FBI was really coming to an end. I wanted to leave on a high, if you will, right? Not be that disgruntled, crabby old agent that nobody wants to work with, right? But importantly, I felt like I still have and had a lot to give, right? And was hopeful that those skills, could be valuable on the private sector side of the house, but still supporting the mission, right? That's still very important, to me. So, by starting, my private company, that I really leverage to assist, others in training, in guest lecturing, on threat assessment, threat management. How can we, be better stewards of securing our community
Mhm.
from a non-law enforcement perspective? And it's been really rewarding to just share, experiences and give people maybe a little insight into how law enforcement thinks and responds to things, but then importantly, what we can do as citizens to assist and become really a part of that Homeland Security apparatus. So it's been a really fulfilling, great journey.
Yes. And say now you look back on your long career, which is still evolving at the moment in the private field. What are the main takeaways from that very intensive experience, those many, many years? What are the things you learned which you wished someone would have told you at
Oh
the
man,
beginning?
yeah, that's great. And I think, the advice I would give to my younger self and that I give to, these young folks who are endeavoring to pick up that mantle and carry on with this, important mission, are really a couple things, right? Communication is huge, right? The ability to not only convince, but convey, right? We oftentimes in law enforcement, you have to convince somebody that what may ultimately result in a loss of their freedom is ultimately the best decision. But then, conveying information. So the ability to not only speak, accurately and succinctly, but also write, professionally, right? In law enforcement in particular, right? You have to submit documents to the court, for example, or you may have to testify in court. Taking initiative is huge. I think we oftentimes, especially, as females, right, we're our own worst critic, and we think of, well, gee, I only meet four of the six of these things, so I'm not qualified. Sure you are, right? Because you've got four of them, or maybe you only have two. But I like to tell folks, why not you, right? Why not you? It's your story and it's your journey. And if you're passionate about it, then go for it, right? No one is perfect. And we can learn is the other thing. So I think being flexible and being a lifelong learner are hugely important. And then I like to talk about leadership, right? When you're in charge, be in charge. But when you're not in charge, be a really, really good teammate. I like to tell folks the only thing you can control is your own reputation. So make sure you're doing that, right? Because it's a very small world and you never know who knows someone that knows you. So, t take the initiative, Be a good communicator, be a good leader, but most importantly, or equally important, I should say, is be a really good teammate.
Hmm. I like that very much. And I think this is important because there's so many different fields, careers that one can enter, right? Especially even just within the field of national security as a whole. But then, you have the finance field, the law field, and so forth. I mean, you have a list or like the medical field, which you wanted to get into when you were starting out, perhaps, right?
Mhm.
So, what do you think makes the field of security and national security, homeland security, so special compared to the others, right? Which are equally good in some respects.
I think what makes it special are the people,
Mhm.
because I think that this field, writ large, really attracts a certain type of individual. And it's that selfless service. It's a commitment to something larger than yourself. You certainly don't get into, a national security field to be a millionaire. It's just, right? You're a steward of the people. You're a public servant, and that's, like that's okay. In fact, it's great. So I think that's what it is. It really is the people, people first, and then the mission, right? I would argue that there's no greater mission than securing our community, right? And that happens in so many different ways, right? It's the fentanyl, eliminating that. It's making sure that we don't get attacked by terrorists over from overseas or from within. Making sure that we can go to school, our kids can go to school and not have to worry about some act of violence taking place. So I think there are so many different aspects of security, that sometimes, right, we tend to think of security as making arrests, and I really think it's so much more than that. And again, I hearken back to in my time at the behavioral analysis unit, right? We weren't making arrests, and most of those cases didn't result in an arrest. But what they did result in is assisting someone who was on a bad path to get off of that bad path and not do something, regrettable.
Mhm. I feel like there is a reoccurring pattern the more people I speak with, that especially prevention is usually even better than at the end, like you say, putting the handcuffs on someone, right? Which is necessary, of course. If not, then it'd be an anarchy, right? Everyone could do what they want.
Right.
But unfortunately, many of the times, the preventive measures don't have that these quantified numbers that
Mhm.
can help you lobby for this program which you want to create, right? As you can't say like the other programs, we handcuffed 50 people. No, here there it's rather an open-ended thing. Is
Sure.
it helpful for us or not? And you see, depending on different people in charge, that it might be more or less important to them, right? So something I do think of interest, and it would be a shame not to speak about it. So, at your time within the FBI, as you focused especially on illicit crimes and drugs, right? What are the main things you learned there from a domestic level? How does the whole, especially drug and illicit substance system function? And what's the best way that, as citizens and as professionals, one can counteract these malicious people?
Well, I think it's a really, it's a difficult challenge, right? Because I think if you look even just from a psychological standpoint, right, people get involved in using drugs for so many different reasons, right? So when you think of that prevention space, I think what I've learned is, um, anecdotally, right, these folks who get involved in using drugs or illicit crimes, right, are missing something else from a human aspect, right? Camaraderie, acceptance, right? So they get driven to gangs or terrorist organizations or drug trafficking organizations, right? Because that becomes their family. So what I've learned, is I think if we can be more sensitive to the needs of others, and not to get squishy, right? But I think there's something to that.
Mhm.
And so from a prevention side of things, right? If you see someone struggling, engage, right? We talked a lot at the behavioral analysis unit about bystanders and the importance of bystanders, right? And if you think of our person of concern as sort of the bullseye, right, and then concentric circles going out, right, people are going to see different things and have different contexts, right? Those things are going to be in a different context depending on how close you are to the individual, at the bullseye. But engaging, right? And helping, right? Even just asking, like, are you okay? Right, is huge. And that just may be that lifeline that that person needs to dissuade them, right, from going down that path of nefarious activities, whatever that may be. So I think, just being a little more kind would be a good thing.
Yes.
Doesn't mean everybody, has to hug and, hold hands, but I do think that, being human and kind would go a long way.
I like that very much. I think that's a good way to end it as well. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity.